Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Pathways Gathering Online. We're excited to have you with us. I am just, as always, every Sunday, I have people who are going to text me and keep me in the loop if we are live and what's happening. So just got the text, so that is great news. And I want to start by saying a huge thank you to our worship team again. And Aaron for the editing. I know I say it every week, but it is a lot of work to put that together, and so we're grateful for each of you who has contributed to that. Also, huge thanks to Clara for that great video. Just a kind of a humorous, fun interlude. Just excellent job. So thanks to that, to her for that. This morning, I wanted to start with a story that I heard this past week from a friend of mine. So I'm going to tell it to you from his perspective as he shared it with me. And he was telling me that this, just a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months actually, a federal officer actually showed up at his farm. And the federal officer had kind of showed up and said, I need to inspect your farm. We've had reports of legally grown things on your property. And so the farmer said, oh, yep, that's fine, my buddy. He was like, yep, go ahead. You can check anywhere, but don't go in that field over there. Well, the officer who was inspecting was furious. He overreacted and verbally exploded, saying, listen, I can go wherever I want to go. I can do whatever I want to do. And he reached into his pocket and he arrogantly kind of pulled out his badge. He's like, do you see this badge? This badge tells you I can go wherever I want. I have the authority of the federal government with me. And he kind of shoved it in my face, my friend told me. He shoved it right in his face. He's like, I can do whatever I want on any land, no questions asked or answers given. Have I made myself clear? My friend nodded politely and said, yeah, okay. And off he went and apologized and got on with his chores. A little bit later, he heard loud screams coming from the direction of the field. As he looked over to see what was happening, he saw the officer running as he was being chased by this big, old, mean bull in the field. With every step, the bull was gaining ground on the officer, and the officer was clearly terrified. So my friend took his tools and threw them down to get rid of. He ran as fast as he could toward the fence and yelled at the top of his lungs, your badge, your badge, show them your badge. Well, I share that story this morning because I am a gardening fan. I wanted to kind of share something light and fun about gardening. And those of you who know me know I have a bit of a passion for gardening. I'm not the best at it. Heather Gross and my mom and some people like that, and Carmen McQuillan, they know gardening. Me, I try my best. And I do love gardening. I find it very enjoyable and fun. I have a mulberry tree out in front of my house that I harvest every year, and we plant tomatoes and cucumbers and all kinds of stuff like that. And one of the things that I've learned about gardening, even though I'm not the best at it, is if you don't tend to your stuff, if you don't care for it and feed it and water it and nurture it, it will not thrive. I had this problem last year with my gardens. I just did not put the time in. I didn't weed them well. I didn't water them enough. I didn't fertilize them, and I did not have a good crop. Well, this morning we're starting into a brand new series called Soul Care, caring for your soul in self-isolation. This season of life that we find ourselves in is really unlike anything that we have seen in our lifetimes. And coming with that is all kinds of challenges and struggles that we are going to face. And I think about, all the noise and all the chaos and the brokenness and the uncertainty. And it leads to the question, how do we tend to the gardens of our souls? How do we nourish our soul in this season of life so that we don't just survive, but we thrive? How do we nourish our souls so that they don't wither in this season, but so that they grow strong and healthy? I also think a series like this is important in this season because I think a season like this of self-isolation can really reveal your priorities. It can really reveal where things are at in the depth of your heart, how you respond to self-isolation, to the highs and the lows of that can really reveal a lot about what's going on inside. You know, when you're upset and frustrated and you go to the cupboard to eat, not because you're hungry, but because it's comforting, it tells us about where we seek our comfort. And it can reveal a lot of the things that exist deep down inside. And so what we want to do is cultivate healthy souls in this season so that we can flourish. Over the next several weeks, we're going to go through several different topics in light of caring for our souls in this season. Today, we're going to talk about fear. And fear is not necessarily something that cultivates our soul, but I would suggest that in this time in our history could be one of the things that kills our soul the most. So we're going to deal with that a little bit this morning. And then over the next several weeks, we're going to talk about emotional health. We're going to talk about spiritual health, relational health, mental health, and even our physical health, because I think all of these things are part of our holistic makeup as human beings, and we need to care for every part of them. As we go through this morning, if you have questions, as always, I encourage you to send those in. You can text them. I've got the handy dandy phone here, so you can text those in to 519-893-2951. You can email me. Again, I won't get those right away, but I'll get those later on and can email you with a response. Or if you post a question in the chat room, I have a couple people in there who are monitoring that and will hopefully be able to send those over to me as the service goes on. Before we get to the good stuff that we're going to be doing in the next few weeks, actually, I do have one other quick thing before I get into that. We have a ton of people, by the way, who have filled out our willing to help section on our website in our COVID-19 response. Many of you have said that you're willing to do things, and I'm so thankful for you. If you know of somebody with a need, we would just encourage you to let us know. We have people who are ready to help, ready to serve. And so those of you who filled those cards out, thank you so much for your willingness. And as we hear of needs, we will definitely point them in your direction. Some of you have offered to make phone calls, and I've already sent you some names. That's great. One kind of unique one that came up that I really appreciated is Matt and Amanda, too, kind of had a different one. And they were wondering if anybody, Matt and Amanda Reese, had said if anybody needs help tutoring your students or just with how to do online education, that they would be willing to step in and help with that. And so if you would like to get in touch with them, just email me, again, shane@pathwaycc.ca, and I will definitely connect you with them. They would like to do that. If there's any of you who are parents who are trying to adjust at home to how to care for your kids' education. So just a side note, also have somebody who would love to make cards. So if you know somebody who would really benefit from a card, receiving a handmade card, I would encourage you to do that. We received one. It was just a blessing to us. So just, again, if that's something that would interest you, let me know, and we will connect with that person in April who is doing some of those. So anyway, thank you guys who have filled those out. Well, let's get into today's topic. And as opposed to being something about focusing on our health this morning, we actually want to begin by talking about something that I think threatens our health. I think it's a topic that if we don't deal with, discuss it, and handle it well, I believe it can cause decay, stunted growth, and can actually hinder our ability to flourish. And so we want to talk about fear this morning and unpack that a bit. I love the quote by theologian and philosopher Miroslav Volf, who was talking about COVID-19 in a podcast I follow. And he said, when a bacterial or virulent pandemic like COVID-19 breaks out, the social pandemic of fear is not far behind. This is because when we see others fearing, we catch the malady of fear ourselves. Fear is infectious. Now, I want to start by saying I don't think all fear is bad. I don't think all fear is evil. But this is the kind of fear that we're talking about today that's insidious. It's a kind of fear that's like a blight on tomatoes that will just cause them all to go black and ruin them completely, or like weeds that get in and choke the life out of our spiritual lives. It's interesting, Jesus told a parable about spiritual lives being choked out. And in the parable of the sower, he talks about different seed being spread on different soil. And in two of the soils, fear is part of the problem. The soil, or the seeds that fall on the rocky ground, it says that they grow quickly, but then the sun scorches them. And when Jesus explains, he says the fears of persecution and of trouble scare them away. In other words, fear keeps them from fully digging their roots into the soil and growing strong and healthy. He also says that the weeds that grow in are the worries of this life and the deceit of wealth. In other words, the longing for money and stuff, and the worries and the troubles and the anxieties of this life can actually keep us from flourishing and growing into the health that God wants for our spiritual lives. That's why I think this series is so important. We must tend to our souls. And fear will potentially hinder us. Now, the truth is, fear being a hindrance to our soul is not something new, is it? Jesus talked about it in the parable of the sower. And for all of us, or for many of us, we deal with different kinds of fears all the time. For some, it's a fear of failure that cripples them and keeps them from experiencing wholeness and health. For others, it's a fear of a lost job, fear of a failed marriage, fear of illness, fear of a child that's going to get hurt, fear of never being able to break out of that addiction, fear of not having enough or running out of money. And if we were to go through the chat room and each go through and say things that we have been feared of that have held us back, I'm sure we could all come up with them, couldn't we? Of course, then there's also a global sense, I think, of fear sometimes, not necessarily just the personal fears of terrorism or fear of a global climate catastrophe, fear of a world economic collapse. Of course, right now, the reason we're all at home, COVID-19, the coronavirus, leads to a tremendous amount of global fear, I think, for many people. Fears of health, fears of global collapse again, fear of others, because I think that's one of the interesting things that happens in light of this coronavirus is this leads to a fear of everyone and everything, because everyone and everything is a source of potential danger. And so what do? How do we deal with this fear? As I was preparing, I couldn't help but think of the ostrich, because I think there are two ways that often people try to deal with fear. There's the ostrich syndrome, which, by the way, I found out was a myth. The whole ostrich myth is that when an ostrich is afraid, it buries its head in the sand. Reading from different zoo websites, that's actually not true. If an ostrich buried its head in the sand, it wouldn't be able to breathe. In fact, ostriches are incredibly fast, so running away is one of their primary mechanisms of defense. Also, they pack a wallop of a kick, pretty strong. So there's that. And if they're really afraid and don't feel they can get away, what they do is lay flat on the ground with their head in the sand. And what that does is their head blends in with the sand, and it can't be seen. Now, the reason I mention that is because I'm not talking here today about us burying our heads in the sand as it relates to fear. We're not talking about ignoring the fear or minimizing the danger. See, I think one of the things we can do when we face fear like this is we can underreact. The great theologian Thomas Aquinas said it well. He said, disregarding or minimizing danger is a sign of pride or stupidity, and likely of both. No, we're not talking about minimizing, pretending it's not a big deal, pretending it's unimportant, because like Thomas Aquinas said, that would be foolish and potentially even prideful. And at its worst, I think it's unloving. Part of the reason we self-isolate and do these things is out of our love for our neighbor. We care about those around us, and we want to protect them. But the equally same truth is that we also don't want to overreact. We also don't want to freak out and allow this to ruin everything that is going on around us. As if somehow this is going to be the end of the world. You hear podcasts and you hear people saying things, and if we aren't careful and we overreact too much, it actually can cause us to be consumed by our fear. It can rob our joy. It can steal our hope. It can allow deep discouragement to set in. And what I would suggest is, though this is a very real concern, the world needs hope right now. Not false hope that minimizes, but real hope that is light in the darkness. And so we want to deal with the question today, how do we live with this menacing cloud over us? In some ways, as I was thinking about it this week, I couldn't help but reflect on how the psalmist felt in Psalm 137. The Israelites had been exiled to Babylon. Babylon had come in and destroyed the temple. It had destroyed Jerusalem, and they had taken many of the most wealthy and held them off to Babylon, where they were held in captivity. They were exiled there, and they're asking the Israelites to sing songs of Zion. They say, and the response of the psalmist in Psalm 137 is, "How can we sing songs of Zion when we are in a strange land? How can we sing songs of hope and joy and celebration when we are in this weird foreign place where we feel trapped, afraid, alone?" And that really resonated with me as I thought about COVID-19. How do we cultivate hope and joy and till the soil of our soul in COVID times? Now, the Bible has a whole lot to say about fear. In fact, the command to fear not in some form or another, or do not be afraid, fear not, take heart, these kinds of things. Who shall I fear? These kinds of things appear in the Bible around 365 times, give or take, which I think is amazing. One per every day. One author I was reading said that it's 366 times, one for every day, including leap year. And Jesus himself, on many instances, even admonishes the people he's talking to not be afraid. John 14:1, he says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Do not be afraid." Carrying on in the same chapter, he says, "My peace I leave you, my peace I give to you. I don't give as the world gives. So do not be afraid. Do not let your hearts be troubled." Psalm 27, the psalmist repeats a few times, "Who shall I fear?" He says, "My heart will not fear." In spite of all the stuff he's going through, and he lists a bunch of that in there, he says, "I will be strong and I will take heart. I will not be afraid." And in 1 John 4, 7 to 18, as he talks about what love is like, he says at the end, there is no fear in love because perfect love casts out fear. And so we don't want to live in a place of fear. The problem is saying fear not to someone who's afraid is like saying stop hiccuping to someone who has the hiccups. This can feel uncaring, dismissive, or unsympathetic. It kind of reminded me of that Bob Newhart video where a woman comes in looking for help because she's afraid. And he tells her, "Stop it! Stop it!" And he kind of yells at her to stop it. And she's like, taken aback, right? She's like, "Whoa, like what? I should just stop it?" He's like, "Yes, stop it." Well, that's not really helpful to us this morning, is it? Having somebody tell us to stop it when we're afraid can actually have the opposite response and can create more fear. And yet the Bible does call us to not live in this place of consuming fear. And so today I want to look at a story in Scripture that I think can shed some light on this for us. The story is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. And it's a story that may be familiar to many of you, but I want to read it this morning as we think about fear. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But suddenly a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Other translations here actually say that began to be swamped. It's not just like, "Oh, there's a little bit of water in the bottom, get your bucket and give her a little scoop." No, like this boat is in very real danger of being swamped. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the water, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now, to give a quick background on this, Jesus has been teaching a lot. Crowds have been gathering around him, bringing him people to heal. He's had confrontations with religious leaders about healing on the Sabbath. And now, as this day comes to an end, as the evening approaches, they get into a boat. And Jesus crawls into the back of the boat. And I love this because the humanity of Jesus, I think, is seen here as he lays down and sleeps. He's exhausted. As they're sailing across, suddenly this huge storm comes up. And in the Greek, there's a sense of it's exceedingly furious squall is what pops up. Now, being in Israel, we had a chance to see the Sea of Galilee and sail on it. And one of the things that I noticed is it's a large enough body of water, but it is not huge. It's big, but it isn't that big. And so what's interesting is that it's not that big of a thing that they're going across. And being, of course, that Jesus and his disciples are in this boat, you have to remember these disciples fished on this very lake, many of them. Jesus called these disciples, several of them, on the shores of this very lake, and many of them made their living fishing on this lake. And all of a sudden, as they're sailing across, this storm comes up, and it is big. And we know it's big because why on earth would it terrify people who have made their lives living on this water? The water is pounding over the boat. The waves are bursting over it. It's not just wavy and rocky, but there is so much water that the disciples, those who have lived on this water, are afraid the boat is going to swamp. And through it all, Jesus is asleep. It's interesting, the storm in this story reminds me just a bit of today. Even on Thursday night, we had a leadership team meeting, and Murray had kind of mentioned this, that, who knew that March 8th, that Sunday morning, would be the last time that we would physically gather in our community center for who knows how long. Who knew that Sunday would be the last time we would physically be together? And it's sort of like, I think, the story, in that all of a sudden this squall comes up furiously. It happens in an instant, and it comes up, and it's so fierce that it threatens our very boat. See, I think something that is important to note, though, is that in this story and ours, there is a just amount of fear. I mean, Proverbs actually says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. Fear can also be protective. Jesus says at one point, don't fear the one who can harm your body, but fear the one who can kill your soul. See, I would suggest to you this morning that the command to fear not doesn't mean that all fear is wrong. I think there are natural God-given instincts that should give us a healthy fear, or a healthy concern, if you would prefer, for certain things. Because I think there's something to be said about fearing rightly. As Max Lucado says, Jesus does not condemn the concern for legitimate responsibilities, but rather the continuous mindset that dismisses God's presence. See, there's a concern. I think there's a place for concern or fear over real things. I think fear has a right place in concern for others. The problem is that instead of fear being a protective mechanism, so often it becomes the problem itself when it becomes all-consuming. The disciples weren't necessarily wrong to be worried about the storm. The boat was being swamped. People who were used to water were terrified. I would suggest rather the problem was in their response. To rightly fear means that we see the danger, but we are not overwhelmed by its prospect. I think Paul says it really well in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 to 10, when he writes, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but not abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies." You see, the dangers Paul faced were real. He wasn't candy coating the issues here. He talks about being persecuted, being struck down, all the things happening to him. But what you see in his language is that though he has true sense of the danger that exists, he is not consumed by the fear. He is not overwhelmed by its prospect. It's interesting, we just celebrated Easter, and on Good Friday, we talked a little bit about Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what we see there is that Jesus was overwhelmed with grief. As he prays, Lord, take this cup from me. He knows what's coming. He asks God if there's any other way, any other way. I think implicit in Jesus' prayer, in this declaration, God, if there's any other way, is a sense of concern and sorrow and grief and fear for what is coming. And yet there's still trust there. The contrast of that is how the disciples respond in their fear. Jesus is asleep and they wake him, and they don't just ask him for help, but their question is, do you not care that we are going to drown? Notice their certainty. They are going to drown. Do you not care, Jesus? You see, when fear overtakes us, we experience ourselves as threatened, vulnerable, fragile, and unable to cope with the danger that faces us. And I think when that happens to us, it creates a sort of spiritual amnesia where we forget what God has done. When fear overtakes us and dominates us and gains control of us, we begin to question and wonder where God is. Is God really good? Is a question that comes to our mind. When we allow fear to consume us and consume our thoughts and steal our hope and our joy, we begin to wonder about God. For the disciples, they had seen Jesus heal many people, taught them all about him. They had spent countless hours with him. But when the fear struck them, when fear overtook them, they began to question Jesus' care for them. You see, for Jesus, in his moment of darkness, he prayed, God, is there any other way? He went to God with his fear, with his sorrow, with his grief. And yet there's a trust implicit in his saying, but not my will, yours be done. He never questions the Father's care for him. He doesn't question the Father's plan or the Father's love, and he submits in light of that. Excessive fear causes us to remove God from the equation. Again, they had seen Jesus do all kinds of miracles, but once the disciples were gripped by fear, their response was, don't you care that we are going to drown? Not Jesus, the storm is bad. Can you help us? Not Jesus, the storm is bad. What should we do? Instead, it's no, we are going to drown. There's a lack of trust, a lack of understanding, and a real loss of hope in the storm. And so Jesus gets up, and I imagine him on the stern of the boat. He goes from the stern to the bow, and he stands up, and he calls out in a loud voice, quiet, be still. And the water settles, and then he turns and says, why were you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? See, I don't think Jesus' point was let the boat get swamped and sink. I don't think Jesus' point was don't annoy me, disciples. Don't bug me with your trivial problems. That's not what Jesus is getting at. He's not saying, it's all good. Don't worry about it, disciples. It's all good. No. Going to Jesus was the right action. The problem was they went to Jesus after they had already been consumed by fear. And the consummation of the consuming of the fear inside of them led them to question Jesus' care for them. Don't you care? We are going to drown. Again, I love the contrast in that versus the Apostle Paul, who talks about being pressed and not crushed, persecuted, not abandoned, struck down and not destroyed. Still acknowledging the storm, still acknowledging what's happening, the persecution, the fear, and the things that are going on, but there is hope because their trust remains. And I think it's so important for us this morning. There certainly is chaos. There's certainly fear. There's certainly lostness and exhaustion and drainness and brokenness that exist. But there is hope in the storm. There is peace in the storm. The storm may last for a time, but we are not alone in the storm. And I love how Paul actually begins that section of talking about why they're able to have this hope. He begins with verse 7 by saying, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show. In other words, fragile containers. That's what we are. But we have this power that's held in there, and it is the power of God, not us. We are not alone. So as we wrap up, let me give you 3 things to answer in our takeaway. How do we deal with excessive fear? And 3 things I want to give you, I think we can learn from Jesus in his darkest days. I mean, Jesus understands what it's like to be overwhelmed with grief and sorrow and fears to what is coming. In fact, in Luke's story of Jesus praying in the garden, it talks about Jesus sweating blood, which is an actual medical condition known as hematidrosis, which can happen when you are under incredible duress and stress and anxiety and worry. You sweat blood. And that's what Jesus was undergoing in Gethsemane the night before, the night of his betrayal and his trial and his conviction. And so how did Jesus handle this extreme stress? Well, first, Jesus prayed. In Matthew 26, 36 to 46, we read the story, and it says that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And so he goes and he prays, take this cup from me. In his darkest moments, Jesus prayed. Even on the cross, as he was nearing the end of his life, he prayed, Father, forgive them. Into your hands I commit my spirit. My God, why have you forsaken me? It seems so simple, and yet so often it's the last thing that we do. Or when we do pray, we only pray, take it away. But my challenge to us this morning is that we would pray that God would give us peace in the storm, that God would calm us, that God would reveal himself in us. In Acts chapter 4, we read of Peter and John being hauled in and questioned by the Sanhedrin for preaching the name of Jesus. And after their question, they run back to the disciples. And what do they immediately do? They gather together and pray. Not that the persecution would stop. Not that they would, not have any more trouble. But what they actually pray is for boldness and courage to continue preaching in spite of that. James 5:13 says, if any of us is in trouble, he should pray. First thing we do when we face excessive fear is pray. A great opportunity for that is tonight. Join us in our prayer meeting. Join us and we can pray for you maybe, or pray together. And we're going to lift up some needs that exist and lift up some things going on in our world. And I encourage you to join us. The Zoom link was sent out through our email. Join us and pray with us. Second thing we see in Jesus, he prays, but there's also an implicit trust in the Father, a belief that God cares. He says, Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, but if not, your will be done. There is a trust here in the Father. Even the way he starts, he says, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. There's an intimacy with the Father here. And though he knows it's about to be bad, he calls on his loving Father. Even though the outcome is not looking good, even though he's likely to go through agony, there is trust and intimacy with the Father. For Jesus, trust was essential. And trust was a part of his prayer life. The question is, do we trust that the Father is good? Do we trust that the Father works for good even when the answer is no, or wait, or not now? Trusting God does not mean we won't face fear. It means, though, that we live as people of faith, not as people of fear. And finally, don't do it alone. Even Jesus in his darkest hour was, when overwhelmed by grief and sorrow, calls on his friends to help him and to pray with him. And of course, his friends didn't do necessarily the greatest job of walking with Jesus in his fear, because we find out in Luke that they too fell asleep because of being overwhelmed with sorrow themselves. You see, they weren't overly successful, and yet Jesus recognized that in his deepest hour of need, in his darkest moments, when he was overwhelmed with sorrow and grief and even fear, with worry and anxiety, he asks his friends to join him and pray with him, to stand beside him. You know, we can't physically do that, but we do have technology that lets us gather in this way, where we can stand together, encourage one another, pray for each other, and care for one another. If we are going to thrive and conquer the consuming fear that can so easily hinder and keep us from growth, it is essential that we do this together. Let me pray. God, thank you for this day today. God, thank you for your love for us. God, thank you that you so loved us that you came. And God, you model for us how we can respond in fear. And so, God, I want to just ask and pray today that you would help us conquer this fear that can keep us from flourishing. God, don't let us succumb to the fear that holds us down or that causes us to question you or question your care for us. God, I pray that when we face fear, we will be driven to our knees and call out to you in prayer, living by faith and trust that you are good, and bringing people around us who will encourage and support us. For this we pray now in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Well, I don't see any questions in, so I'm going to send us on our way. If questions do come in after, I will respond to those in a different way. But I pray that you've been blessed this morning. And as we go forward, I cannot wait to talk about some of these things that are going to help nourish our souls in this season. Join us in the coming weeks as we explore that together. My longing for you as a fellow follower of Jesus is that you would grow in this season. God bless you all.